Steve Bryan. He's muted.
Spurs fan, I have almost no interest at all in the successful future of football.
So, sorry, Steve, we didn't catch the start of that declaration. I'm very sorry. Could you repeat?
I have in the past accepted tickets from the Premier League to football events.
Thank you. Giles Watling.
I have no interest to declare apart from membership of a lovely cricket club in Frinton.
Thank you. Julie Elliott.
I've in the past year accepted tickets from the ECB to cricket, and in the past from the RFU.
Clive Efford.
My only declaration is that I'm chair of trustees of a sports club that receives grants from Sport England.
And that's Samuel Montague, I believe, isn't it? Yeah. In the Kent League, I know well. Philip Davis.
I've got no financial interest to declare from any of today's witnesses, although I am a season ticket holder with my two sons at Bradford City.
Oh, poor goodness. We'll skate over that. Damien Green.
Thank you, Chairman. No, mine is also a reverse declaration of interest. I'm a season ticket holder at Reading Football Club, and I'm a member of Surrey County Cricket Club.
Damien Hines.
None.
No. Kevin Brennan.
I have accepted invitations to various sporting events, particularly with the Welsh Rugby Union.
Thank you. Brilliant. Okay, well, we're going to start. Our first witness is Rick Parry, the chairman of the English Football League. Good morning, Rick.
Good morning.
Good morning. Worst case scenario, after, say, the next 12 months, as we come out of this Covid-19 situation, how many football clubs in the EFL could we lose as a result? Worst case scenario.
It's a very difficult question to answer. Clearly, our objective is to try and make sure that we lose none. Our avowed aim is to emerge stronger, leaner, more efficient, to have a proper reset post-COVID. We are heading for a financial hole of about £200 million by the end of September, a cash hole, which we will need to fill. And clubs are stacking up creditors as well. We have a great deal of uncertainty around next season, of course. The great undetermined matter being when we're going to return to playing in front of crowds, which for the EFL is absolutely critical. We're much more dependent on revenue, and indeed we're much more dependent upon the atmosphere generated by crowds potentially than the Premier League. So that is a critical date for us. But I think in the absence of knowing that, to speculate as to whether clubs will be out of business by next year, I think it's premature. As I said, we'll be doing everything in our power to make sure that all of them survive.
Okay, the reason I asked that question is I've just come off the phone with a chairman of a football club in the EFL, and I'll just tell you what they told me. They said to me that basically they'd offered their players a 20% pay cut between April and July, and that the players had agreed to that in order basically to help close a little bit of the financial black hole that they face. But the PFA then decided that that wouldn't be the case, and they said that there would be a deferral for April only. And now the PFA has actually appointed Deloitte's rather expensive company to employ to effectively go through the books of football clubs in order to see whether or not they are being genuine in asking players in order to forgo salaries or partial for giving up of salaries. This football chairman was desperate. He said to me that effectively by the end of the year he faces a shortfall of £1.3 million and that he has no income coming in at all. Not just gates, no hospitality, nothing actually coming in. Is that a familiar story? And if so, what do you think of the role of the PFA in this? And what do you think in terms of the way out?
It will not be an unfamiliar story. As I've said, the cash hole towards autumn looks pretty grim. We're well aware of the appointment of Deloitte. It's a process we're involved with. We've been discussing matters with the PFA for several weeks, and within the last month we've also established our own group of club captains, 6 captains who we're talking to on a weekly basis with a view to explaining the depth of the problem. Our approach really is to say we're all part of the problem, therefore we all need to be part of the solution, the clubs, the players, the owners, We all need to share in the pain. But we're really having an open book policy, and we're saying, listen, we're going to actually show you how deep the pain is, because what became apparent at the start of the process, the players were not aware of the seriousness of the situation. They will be aware of it very shortly. And I said, we are absolutely on board with the Deloitte process. We have no problem with the principle of demonstrating the depth of the problem. If then the players, having seen the depth of the problem, are unwilling to share in the pain, it'll be a very different conversation. But I said, our approach thus far has been open book, share the problem, share the pain, and then let's work to a common solution.
Has there been a breakdown in the relationship between the players' union and the clubs?
I'm not sure how strong the relationship has been historically. I don't think there's been a particular breakdown. I think it's unprecedented times. None of us have been through a situation quite like this. And as I said, we have a regular dialogue, and we anticipate that that will bear fruit. As I said, our approach at the moment is transparency, share the problem, and let's come up with a joint solution.
You must have been tearing your hair out at the news from the Premier League that they're furloughing non-playing staff while continuing to pay wages on average of 3.5 million per year to players. Did that give football a bad name?
I think it got some unfair criticism. Many of our clubs have furloughed players. I think the furlough scheme was a very straightforward one. I've read that 6.3 million employees have been furloughed. The total cost will be 8 billion. There was no stipulation whether it was to apply to big companies, small companies, public companies, private companies. We've seen major companies furlough tens of thousands of employees. And I think it's unfair that football has been singled out. For many of our clubs lower down, particularly in League One and League Two, it's been an absolute lifeline. It's been immensely helpful getting them through the last couple of months and the next month or two. So I'm a huge fan of the furlough scheme, and the speed with which it was introduced, I think, was commendable. And frankly, I see no reason why football shouldn't be as eligible as any other business to take advantage.
So there'll be any differential between the EFL and obviously clubs that are financially very straitened and those football clubs which have economics which are very different in the Premier League?
Well, I think in terms of the furlough, that's a question to ask the Chancellor in terms of, it applies to the corner shop, and it also applies to British Airways. It applies across every industry. So why should football be treated separately?
Okay. In terms of Gordon Taylor's role in these negotiations, he's publicly stated before that he's looking to step down. Do you think his role has been positive in terms of these negotiations?
I think so. We are happy with the way that the dialogue is going. I think at times it's been frustrating that it hasn't been a little quicker. But as I said, I think everybody's hurting at the moment, and bearing in mind a lot of the players down at League Two level are not exactly overpaid, to say the least. They've got families, they've got mortgages, they've got commitments. They're worried about their futures. We have 1,400 players coming out of contract at the end of June. That is a train coming down the tunnel very, very quickly. And they are going to be extremely concerned about their futures and whether they're going to be able to get new contracts, because I think the landscape going forwards in terms of wages and costs incurred by the clubs has got to change. There's no question about that.
Now, there's been obviously a lot of talk about the Premier League resuming in maybe a month or so's time in order to try and complete the season. How does that impact the EFL? Would you expect, for example, to be treated in the same way? Would you expect that you start at the same time? Or is there some way in which that money effectively could trickle down from the Premier League in order to help EFL clubs, and therefore you want to see it starting as quickly as possible?
We'd love to see some money trickling down. We haven't seen any evidence of it yet, but I'm sure the Premier League have some ideas which they'll tell us about in due course. We want to resume playing. We've always said we want to resume playing purely from the point of view of sporting integrity, when it's safe to do so. We want to make decisions based on hard fact and data rather than on speculation. We will return when the government says it's safe, when the government sets the criteria, and we'll do so in a way that makes sure our players and all of our staff are healthy. The health of a League Two player is at least as valuable as the health of a Premier League player. And of course, we want to ensure there is no stress on the National Health Services, the frontline services, or the emergency services. The one plea I would make, which is a very sincere one, is that I think the Premier League and the government are working on a twin track approach, which is essentially work out when it's safe to return to train, start training, and then take a decision on when it's safe to return to play. That absolutely does not work for us. We have to work backwards. Our end date, realistically, is the 31st of July because of the situation with players' contracts. We can't go beyond July. Players have been furloughed, staff have been furloughed. To expect our clubs, the smaller clubs, to bring players and staff back into training now, to forego the furlough only then in a month to find they can't play, would be a complete mess. So we actually need within days to be taking decisions. So what we really need is guidance on the criteria for return to play. We need that really very, very quickly because, as I said, we can't delay decisions. Working back from July, players have to be back in training relatively soon. So critical dates are coming up for us.
If the majority of money comes from gate receipts and subsidiary elements around a football match, is it really in your, apart from football integrity, of course, a very important issue, is it really in your interest in order to see yourselves back playing this season? Because we understand why the Premier League will want to, because it's broadcast revenue, but your broadcast revenue is less. So is it important that the EFL actually starts back up?
We still have broadcasting and sponsorship contracts, which we have to bear in mind. The question is entirely valid, and that is definitely a consideration. I think one statistic from 2018 is a really interesting one. Premier League wages were £2.9 billion. The TV deal was £3 billion. So you could say that the TV deal covered the wages of the Premier League clubs. EFL wages in 2018 were £1 billion. The TV contract was 100 million, only 10% of the wages.
Right.
So you're absolutely right. At League One and League Two level, gate receipts represent 32% of income, slightly less than that at the Championship. Gate receipts are absolutely fundamental. And that applies not just to this season, but increasingly it applies to next season. And I think we have to look long and hard at how we go about restarting next season, or indeed whether we restart next season without crowds.
Okay, great. Steve Bryan.
Chair. Good morning, Mr. Parry. Thank you for joining us. Could I just return to the part the chair was asking you very briefly about the furlough scheme, and you said you thought it was unfair that football had been criticised, including by this committee. You just quoted then that Premier League wages are 2.9 billion and TV revenue is 3 billion, whereas the EFL 1 billion and 100 million respectively. So yes, the Chancellor didn't say that football should or shouldn't be in the furlough scheme, but do you not think that there was a moral obligation on Premier League clubs, some of whom are paying players millions of pounds each month, that they should be, hundreds of thousands of pounds each month, they wish, that they should have had a moral obligation to not take public money to furloughs?
I don't see it that way. I respect that you see it in a different way. It's not as if the Premier League were furloughing players. They were furloughing relatively lowly paid staff who might otherwise have, I guess, been made redundant or suffered. So,
yeah. And that was our point, that they didn't need to do that, given that they have such a high wage bill for their playing stars.
I respect your position. I beg to differ.
Okay, all right. You mentioned about the players out of contract at the end of June. So what guidance is the EFL then giving to clubs about player contracts which are due to run out at the end of next month?
Well, I think it's not so much guidance as dialogue with the clubs, constant dialogue. We're having weekly calls with our clubs to assess information as it comes in, and clearly, as you'll be acutely aware, this is a situation that changes daily. I've always said that the disease is actually going to decide what happens. We're not in control of the timetable. We have to be very agile. It is very much one step at a time, but clearly the clubs are having to tighten their belts. We don't have to tell them that. They are very much aware of that. I mean, again, the EFL model financially was not great before the virus. We were in a position in 2018 where in the championship, wages were 106% of turnover. That model is not sustainable at any time. It is definitely not sustainable during the virus. It is definitely not sustainable post-virus. So some harsh decisions have to be taken. Even in League One and League Two, on average, wages are around 80 to 90% of turnover. This just doesn't work. So tough decisions are going to have to be taken now. And big decisions are going to have to be taken for the future in terms of sustainability. We need a complete reset and a rethink about how the business model works. And perhaps one benefit of going through this pain is we will be shocked into coming up with a more sustainable model for the future.
Yeah, I can see that. And so then following on from that, players, staff, many of whom, as you say, rightly, are certainly lower down the leagues, are not well paid. They must be feeling that uncertainty of their business, their club, the same as many people are at the moment. So I just wonder, what conversations are you having as a business with your clubs about the mental and physical health of the playing staff and the non-playing staff, because it must be taking a toll on them.
It is taking a toll. I'm not sure that, I mean, in these difficult times, I think it's difficult to single out football because there is a toll being taken on many industries. I think what's unusual in this situation, going back to discussions with the PFA and with broadcasters, we're in an unusual situation in that we're not on the opposite side of the table. We're actually all on the same side of the table. Everybody is suffering a degree of pain, and therefore, as I touched on earlier, there does need to be a common understanding, a shared understanding of the problem. Then you can move into a sharing of the solution. But I think the mental health aspects, the strain upon players, is a really important issue, and I think it's one that clubs are tackling in their different ways.
Yeah, understood. And then just finally from me, can I just ask you about the football? Obviously, Leeds United are currently top of the championship, but it's a 1 point difference from second place. If the season didn't conclude, as has happened in other European countries, if the season didn't conclude, should Leeds be awarded the championship title, and your old club Liverpool, should they be awarded to be champions? Because it'll always be sort of champions, won't there? There'll always be an asterisk next to them on the Wikipedia entry. Should that happen?
My view would only be a personal one. I think it's premature. I think that's one that will, if and when the season doesn't finish, that will be a one for measured debate and consideration. There won't be a right answer. There is no right answer, but what we have to try to do is to come up with a fair and balanced answer that is appropriate in all of the circumstances, but not one for me to speculate on today, I think.
You would be asked your opinion. I mean, to use a football analogy, it's never over till the final whistle. Liverpool had a wobbly period before the cessation of playing. I just wonder whether, what would you throw into the mix yourself personally?
I will frame my opinion in due course based on an analysis of all the facts, and today is premature, I'm afraid.
Okay, very diplomatic. Back to you, Chair.
Hello, was that me, Chair? Sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Chair. Just following on from that, Mr. Parry, what discussions have you had with the Premier League about promotion and relegation?
Our conversations have been very straightforward. We expect 3 clubs to be promoted. The Premier League is aware of our position on that. In all of the conversations that we've had with the Premier League, I think their position is they expect 3 clubs to be relegated.
What would happen if they change their mind on that?
Well, I think you can expect the lawyers are going to get wealthy if that happens. There will be a degree of outrage, varying degree of outrage from a number of our clubs in the Championship. It would be a breach of the tripartite agreement between us, the Premier League, and the Football Association. I suspect the Football Association would have a position on it as well. So I think the safe answer to that is it would get very messy, because our expectation is that there will be 3 clubs promoted from the Championship.
Shouldn't the principle be that you should, whatever happens around all of this, that you should finish one season before you start another?
I think that is a point of view. As I said, I don't think we have too many right answers at the moment. There is a scenario in which we could all delay. We could come back and restart, finish this season in September or in January. The counter argument, the fundamental counter argument to that is the sporting integrity one, because we'd be starting again with completely different squads. That would be unfortunate, to say the least. And as I said, given all the challenges we're facing and the uncertainties we're facing around next season, the economics, the logistics, I mean, who knows when it's going to be safe to return? Who knows whether there's going to be a second wave of this virus? Who knows whether next season is going to be interrupted? I think on balance, we have to resolve this season quickly and then move on. Enable ourselves to plan next season with clarity and removing as much clutter as possible.
If you manage to get back to playing out this season, my own club, Cardiff City, is a couple of points off the places at the moment. But if you did manage to get back playing, is there any discussion below Premier League level about this idea of playing on neutral grounds to avoid fans congregating? We're modelling many scenarios. Our preference would be to play on the 71 grounds. We're not sure that there is an overwhelming argument, particularly if we go down our divisions, that the probability of fans congregating is a major one. We've had. It is at big clubs like Cardiff City, Mr. Parry, possibly.
Possibly, absolutely. And as I said, what we're not going to do is to take any decisions which will impose strain on the emergency services or the frontline services. So any decision that we took would be guided by government and guided by our discussions with the police and the safety authorities. So,
did you hear Gordon Taylor on the Today programme this morning on the BBC talk about possibly playing halves of football less than 45 minutes, and did you understand what that was about, and have there been any discussions about that?
I didn't hear it. I have just been told about it.
What do you think that might have been about?
I don't know. There haven't been any discussions about it that I'm aware of. There have been discussions about with the FA and with FIFA about increasing the number of substitutes allowed to 5. And I mean, clearly it would be to reduce the I guess it's the aim could only be to reduce the strain on the players who'll be coming back after a fairly long period away. I mean, I don't think we should be ruling out any creative ideas at the moment, given all the challenges we face. As I said, not heard that one before, but no reason why it shouldn't be added into the creative.
What would be the purpose of it?
Well, I guess we may end up with a situation where we'll have a very compressed fixture schedule, where we'll be trying to cram more games in than normal. And so perhaps the thinking is that, as I said, that would alleviate the tiredness and help the players with recovery, maybe reduce the likelihood of injuries. I guess that's what Gordon's thinking was. Whether there's any basis in fact in it, and said we haven't studied it.
Okay. So. Can I ask you one final question, because I know lots of people would like to ask questions on this whole business of the economics of football below the Premier League. To what extent are you saying that you believe that's caused by players being paid too much, or to what extent is it caused perhaps by the way that these businesses have been run? Very often with the people running them taking very large chunks of money out of the businesses for themselves.
That's an interesting notion. at the moment, across a year, taking a snapshot, our owners are putting in £440 million into their clubs. In the Championship, it's about 380 million, £16 million per club of owner funding, which probably makes that the most expensive lottery ticket on the planet. That's all with a view to trying to get up into the Premier League. So far from taking money out, owners are bailing out their clubs. Championship clubs lost 320 million in 2018. The cause of that is the gulf between the Premier League and the Championship. I mean,
so were you hinting that there should be more money trickling down from the Premier League, or that things like salary caps should be introduced, as in rugby, into football?
I think both. I think salary caps, cost control are absolutely essential. There's a lot of debate going on about that at the moment. We have an imbalance in the distribution. We have the parachute payments, which cause immense stress within the Championship. So yes, indeed, I do think the distribution model is a problem. And as I mentioned earlier, any model where wages are 106% of turnover is ridiculous. But I said that the figure I go back to in response to your question is £440 million of owner funding going into the clubs, not out.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Philip Davis.
Very much. Thank you very much, Chairman. Mr. Parry, I mean, I noted earlier about the comments that you made about the financial viability of clubs. I mean, it's not difficult to see the problem. I mean, Bury went bust. Macclesfield have already not been paying their players throughout the course of the season at various points. So they're already struggling, many of these clubs in lower leagues. It's not difficult to see that this could finish them off. I noticed in your answers to Steve Bryan that you were very careful not to criticise the Premier League and Premier League clubs in any way. And I suspect if I was in your position, I'd do exactly the same, because isn't it the case that for these clubs to survive, you're going to have to rely on the Premier League clubs bailing out the lower league clubs?
I wouldn't use the word bailing out. I think what we need is, as I said, I do think we need a complete reset. I think we do need to look at the redistribution of the revenues. I touched on parachute payments, which I think are an evil that need to be eradicated, because we have 6 clubs in the Championship in receipt of parachute payments, giving them an average of 40 million a club. The other 18 clubs get 4.5 million each. So they are then struggling to try to keep up. Lower down, the solidarity money is welcome, but it becomes very, very small. So yeah, I do think there is a need for a reset. I wouldn't call it a bailout. I'd call it a restructuring and a rethinking. Yes, for me, it's overdue and it's necessary.
But I mean, whether you can call it what you like, whether it's a bailout or whatever. But in the short term, surely the only way lower league clubs are going to survive at the moment, we've heard that they've got no income at the moment. I mean, my club, Bradford City, normally sell 14,000 season tickets a year for the following season. Then they've taken them off sale because they can't be guaranteed that they're going to be playing in front of crowds next season. They've literally got no money coming in at the moment. Surely, just in the short term, whether you call it a bailout or not, that's what's needed in the short term. Otherwise, surely there's going to be a hell of a lot of clubs who are going to go under.
We need a rescue package. I completely agree with that. But I do think we also, in the same time, need to address the longer term, because otherwise we'll be back into problems in 2 to 3 years. So the two do need to go hand in hand. But absolutely, as I highlighted earlier, heading for a 200 million cash shortfall at the end of September, that is acute. That does need a rescue. But then, as I said, hand in hand with that, we need to know where we're heading in 2 and 3 years. We need hope. We need a plan. We need to have some clarity on the longer term future as well. We can't just go from one bailout to another bailout. We have to look at the structure and assess it root and branch.
No, I get that. So let's unite on calling it a rescue package. What discussions have you had with the Premier League about a urgent rescue package for the lower league clubs?
Well, the Premier League has said that if they're allowed to play, they'll be in a position to talk to us about support for the lower leagues. So, as I said, we await that day. The discussions to date have been, I think it's fair to say the discussions to date have been limited, but we look forward to further ones once they have clarity on the direction that their season is taking.
So is the biggest factor in the survival of lower league clubs in the English Football League, is their survival dependent on the Premier League completing its season?
I'm not sure it's dependent on the Premier League completing its season. If that's what gives the Premier League the clarity and the ability to come and talk to us, that would be very welcome. But as things stand at the moment, there is no direct link between the Premier League restarting and the survival of our clubs.
But don't the Premier League need to complete the season in order to get the money in that might help your rescue package? Without the Premier League season finishing, presumably they might have to repay the TV rights or some of them, and there'd be no money left for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely get that. But the only point I'm making is that the rescue package isn't in place yet. If that does assist the Premier League, great, and I'm all in favour of the Premier League completing its season. But as I said, there's nothing in place at the moment that would flow directly from it.
And just finally, Chem, because I know lots of people want to ask a question, can you just tell us the mechanism for determining whether or not you will complete your season or not? Is it the clubs themselves that decide? Is it the EFL board that decides for them? What's the decision-making process in the EFL for deciding whether or not you finish your season or not?
It will go to the clubs. I think the board technically would have the powers to make a decision, but I think it would be wholly appropriate in this situation to make sure that it went to the clubs.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you. Damien Green. Damien Green.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Chair. Thank you, and good morning. I'm interested that you, and heartened that you say this crisis needs to be the point where you reset the way the game is run financially outside the Premier League, and fascinated that you talked favourably about a wage cap. It seems slightly ironic that 60 years ago, abolishing the maximum wage was one of the great achievements of bringing football very belatedly into the 20th century. And now in the 21st century, we're talking about reimposing it. Has any thought been given to the practicality of that?
Yeah, we're not. I think there's a very real distinction. We're not reimposing a maximum wage. We're not capping at an individual level. The maximum wage applied to every single player. What we're talking about is capping the amount that individual clubs can pay, so they would have discretion within that to pay players whatever they wanted to pay them. So we're not capping individual wages, which would, I am certain, almost certain would be illegal. We're looking at some form of cost control which limits the total budget that clubs are allowed to spend.
And might that involve limits on the size of squads as well? So I've seen some figures suggesting that the average wage in the Championship is somewhere north of £600,000, which, given, I mean, you made the point yourself, that the wages are higher than turnover at the moment, which is an absurd situation. So do you think this will inevitably mean not just, for some people, obviously lower wages, but also smaller squads as well?
Yes, I'm a big believer in restricting squad sizes. And I think particularly in the lower leagues, it's being debated at the moment. There are mixed views. We are studying a series of different models, some of which involve limiting squad sizes, some of which don't. As I said, personally, I think it's a good idea because at least it's a step in the right direction of exercising some control. I think the other thing that it does, which potentially dovetails with Premier League and FA thinking, is it enables us to reform the loan system. And one of the things we're keen to obtain from FIFA, for example, which might take a bit of persuasion, is a relaxation, a bit more flexibility on youth loans, being able to take players on short-term loan. there's a great concern at Premier League level and particularly within the FA about lack of first team opportunities for developing talent, 18 and 19-year-olds. We can provide ample opportunities for competitive football. So perhaps smaller squads of full-time professionals augmented by up-and-coming talent from up and above helps the Premier League and helps us economically. So those are the sort of models that we are considering at the moment.
Okay, well, that sounds quite encouraging. I'm interested how strongly you condemned parachute payments. And as you said, I think at the moment there are 6 championship clubs receiving parachute payments. Therefore, almost logically, if the clubs have to take the decision, a majority of the clubs won't be getting parachute payments, so may well be hostile to them. I mean, how close do you think you are to getting sort of strong opposition up to parachute payments?
Strong opposition in the EFL, that's almost a given, apart from the clubs who are receiving them. Opposition within the Premier League, I suspect there isn't any at the moment because they are a prime example of the Premier League clubs being protected, either to help them to get back into the Premier League quickly or to help them adjust to the financial chasm, whichever way you describe it. But they are merely a symptom of the chasm. If we didn't have the chasm in the first place, you wouldn't need the parachute payments. You could have a much fairer distribution system.
So, but there's no mechanism by which the EFL can, as it were, take on the Premier League and tell them you can't pay these payments to clubs that are currently there.
They're nothing to do with us. They're not paid to the EFL. We're not consulted on the size of them. They are distributed by the Premier League to their former clubs.
Okay, thanks. One last short-term issue. I'm struck that some clubs, the players have agreed to defer payments. Others they haven't. I understand clubs are saying that either all first-team players agree to do this or they don't. Are you encouraging clubs, or in this case players, to agree to a deferral of wages, since, as others have mentioned, season ticket holders are paying for no product at the moment and are sort of happy to do so because they'll all want to support their clubs. But it would be good to see some kind of recognition that we're all in this together from the first team players, some of whom, as you say, are well paid.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, you have to remember we don't have, a comment was made about the PFA and the relationship. We don't have a strict collective bargaining agreement. Wages have never been negotiated between the EFL and the PFA. Wages have always been negotiated between club and player individually. So it's actually quite difficult to suggest that there can be some overall mechanism. And it's difficult to think of an overall percentage that would apply to every club because their finances are so different. But the overall principle of the players taking a share of the responsibility is absolutely essential. It's precisely why we have established our captains group. It's precisely why we've been prepared to open the books and to support the appointment of Deloitte to examine the finances so the players can see the evidence. I mean, the one thing I would touch on, which I think is important from the players' point of view, is that there is often a different attitude, which I can understand completely in squads, the difference between those who've got long-term contracts and those who are out of contract in June. The ones who are out of contract in June, facing considerable uncertainty, are the ones who are more reluctant to accept deferrals on the basis of, well, are we ever going to see them? Will we get them back? When will we get them back? And of course, some clubs have up to 20 players out of contract. Some have 2 or 3 players out of contract. So to get unity across a squad when there are different concerns, different profiles is, I mean, frankly, it's challenging, but the message will have to get home soon that the clubs cannot afford to pay.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Live effort.
Thank you, Chair. I'm sorry if I missed it, but did you give a figure for what the EFL stand to retrieve from the situation if they were to be able to finish the season?
No, I didn't. And so, could you just clarify Clive?
Well, if no games were to take place at the Premier League or Football League from now on, this was it. This season's finished, and you plan to start in the autumn. What is the figure that you've lost, and what would you regain by restarting and finishing this season?
I think at our level, if we were starting behind closed doors, then it's finely balanced economically, but it's probably almost neutral, and in fact for many clubs it would actually cost them to play, because they'll be putting on, clearly they've got the cost of staging games. We stand to lose clearly an element of broadcast revenue if we're unable to complete the season, but given that our broadcast contract is clearly nowhere near that of the Premier League, that's a relatively small contribution. So it's not really so much the economics of we need to finish the season in order to generate revenue. It is the sporting integrity part of we want to complete the season, because then we have promotion, we have relegation, and we finish the season clean. But the economics in our case are finely balanced. I think it's very different clearly at the Premier League level, whose broadcast contracts are far greater, with a much greater international spread. I think it's much more important from their point of view that they're able to deliver that televised product. As I said, Clive, as you know, at the EFL, with aggregate attendances of 18 million, we are a spectator sport. We're a local sport. We're not an international event in the way that the Premier League is. So without spectators, the clubs are hurting. We are looking at ways of streaming our product via iFollow, which is a hugely successful EFL streaming platform. So we would be able to recoup some money that way, but it wouldn't make up for the whole shortfall.
So it's not financial; it's really the integrity of the league. But if it doesn't finish on the same basis as it started, for instance, if there were different squads or it were played, shorter matches, double headers, or whatever it is, is it the same integrity? Is it finishing with the same integrity? Is it worth the risk, really?
Clive, I think that is the key question. That is the absolute key question that we have to address in the coming days. The component we need is what do we need to do in order to comply with government guidelines? What are those government guidelines going to be? What are the costs of testing programs and additional hygiene requirements going to be? And then absolutely the decision is going to be taken on the basis of is it really worth it? Is it feasible? Should we come to a point where we're focused more on next season and addressing the short and medium term financial challenges, free from the clutter?
But just one last question, which is about the players. What you say, you've got this group of 6 captains that you talk to. I mean, what do they feed back to you about how players feel about going back? I mean, isn't there a danger here that there's a head of steam that gets up about the presumption that football goes back? I mean, if you listen to Gordon Taylor this morning, he was very much saying, my players are not afraid to go back, and it always accepting that this was going to happen, certainly at the Premier League level. But isn't there a danger then that players feel forced into going back when they may not want to?
Yeah, there is that danger, and I think it's fair. Of course, they're concerned. They raise the concerns when we speak to them, and I think it's absolutely fair to say, Clive, there are mixed views. There are some clubs who talk to the players and they're bored and they want to get back playing. There are others where players have young families, they have pregnant partners, they have elderly relatives. They are concerned. So I guess just as in the population as a whole. Is there a single view about what happens post-lockdown? Yes, absolutely, there are going to be concerns. Is the risk acceptable? That's going to be very much part of our judgment when we see the science, when we see the requirements. But as I said, the health of League Two players is absolutely as relevant and important to us as the health of Premier League players. So that absolutely will be uppermost in our thinking.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your evidence today, Mr. Parry. We're now going to move on to our second witness, who is Tom Harrison, the Chief Executive Officer of the England and Wales Cricket Board. Good morning, Mr. Harrison.
Morning, Chair. Morning everyone.
First question for you. I heard you on the Sky Sports podcast during my 1 hour of exercise allowed every day. And on that, you mentioned the fact that you'd sold 175,000 tickets to the 100 and you projected income of 41 million as against an expenditure of 30 million. That's now all in tatters, isn't it?
Those figures aren't quite right, Chair. That's income of 51 million against a budget of 40 million. But
Right, okay.
you're quite right around the 175,000 tickets that we had.
That money's not coming in.
No, large amounts of that money are not coming in. We're obviously still working on what the impact of Covid-19 is across the entire game. Clearly, it's a much greater impact than just on the 100. But we anticipate that with no cricket this year, as being a worst case scenario for our planning purposes, that could be as bad as £380 million across and that would be the loss of 800 days of cricket across all of our professional clubs and the ECB as well. If you take all of that revenue and put it at risk, then that's the worst case scenario for us this year. But through this process of understanding the impact of COVID-19 on our country, as well as on cricket, we've obviously taken decisions in line with three basic principles. The first being public safety and the safety of our players, the safety of our staff and teams around the country and our colleagues in the network. The second has been to do whatever we can to support the cricket network, the county cricket clubs and the recreational clubs around the country. And the third has been to work in partnership with the game to the full extent that we're able to do so. And I'm very pleased to and very grateful to the support of my colleagues in the Cricket Network for the spirit of partnership that they've engendered through this very, very difficult moment in our history. But unquestionably, I think for cricket, it's the most significant financial challenge we've ever faced.
Okay. And it's particularly exacerbated because of the fact that you were putting a huge gamble. It seemed to be going reasonably well in terms of ticket sales for the 100, and that has basically exacerbated the situation. You were a real maximum moment of effectively of weakness, if you like, or potential sort of that harm, and this is just blowing that away. So can you sort of sum up for the committee exactly how much money you're going to lose as a result of this, and how many people across the game are potentially going to lose their jobs?
Look, first of all, I wouldn't categorise the 100 as a gamble. The 100 is a profit centre for cricket, as has been demonstrated by the figures that you announced earlier. You know, it was going to bring in £11 million of revenue to the game this year. It carries with it an extra dividend for the counties, which is critical revenue for them.
But that isn't happening now, is it? And when you say it isn't a gamble, it's something called a profit centre. At the same time, there's been widespread disquiet over the advent of the 100 and the fact that there was this large outlay in order to bring it about. So you put this large outlay, you've invested, you've bet the house effectively on red, and unfortunately the casino has closed. What is the amount of money you're going to lose from this? And as I say, how many jobs are going to be lost?
Yeah, I disagree with your characterisation of the 100 being a huge gamble. I think ultimately we'd sold 170,000 tickets in February for this year's men and women's 100. We took a decision that based on the fact that operationally we're just simply unable to deliver the 100 this year, the fact that we couldn't guarantee overseas players and coaches coming from different parts of the world, the fact that a huge number of staff are furloughed through the network, and we're obviously trying to do things differently with the 100 and present the game in a way that grows the sport in this country, which we feel is a crucial part of the Inspiring Generations strategy that we've adopted for cricket, that I gave evidence to the committee about in October last year. I think in terms of the position we put ourselves in for the 100, right at the moment that COVID-19 struck, we were in a very, very strong place. No one's the game had never sold 100 that number of tickets in at that speed before, with the exception of the Cricket World Cup. So we were in a very strong position to achieve exactly what we set out to achieve through growing the audience for cricket in this country. The profile of ticket buyers was extremely encouraging, young adults and parents coming with their children, so doing exactly the job that we wanted it to do. And I think there was a huge amount of momentum building up around the 100, which we will carry into next year when we renew our ambition to continue to grow the game in a post-COVID scenario. So yes, this year is going to be extremely difficult, Chair. It's not limited to the 100. It's a drop in the ocean, frankly, in comparison to the losses that we're likely to experience across the network. So I think when you're dealing in the sort of numbers that cricket is dealing with, it goes way beyond the impact of one competition.
Yeah, but again, how much has it cost the council 100?
Well, those figures are sensitive. I will write to you about the exact breakdown of those figures. Obviously, they are linked to commercial contracts, and that we will write to you with the exact impact of those numbers as and when post this meeting, of course. Okay.
Large numbers of counties have taken on quite large debts, often to fulfil the requirements of hosting international matches. How are they going to survive this crisis?
Right, so look, it's definitely a difficult one, but look, as I set out at the start, our priority has been firstly public safety, secondly to support the county network wherever we can. So, we've put a stimulus package of £61 million into the county network to help sustain the short-term revenue losses. You'll appreciate that this time of year is the time of year where we're starting to generate income. Not necessarily just through match day revenues, but obviously match day revenues are important, but all the membership income is coming, the subscription income, and all of that is put to some extent at risk, and clearly for those international grounds, when we are postponing matches to later in the summer, there's obviously an implication on ticket refunds as well. So cash flow is a very significant issue that we've tried to address as quickly as possible through the stimulus package that we put into the professional game. Having said all of that, there's no question that, whilst we're looking forward to, we came into 2020 in probably the best financial state that county cricket had been in for many, many decades, frankly. And this has thrown that into some uncertainty, as you've pointed out. But we will continue to work with the counties to make sure we navigate through this and try to take hard decisions. I think we're going to have to take a good look, as football has, through Mr. Parry's evidence, take a good look at our cost base, because that is clearly an issue that we have to address now, and has been one that cricket has needed to address for some time.
When you say your cost base, you mean player wages, the number of counties, for instance, because there's a lot of suggestions that there are just too many.
I think when I say looking at our cost base, it's how do we create 18 sustainable and viable businesses once we have cut our cloth accordingly. And obviously, all that's happened through COVID, Chair, is that the fact that we have less money coming into the sport than we did before COVID. Now, so we have to cut our cloth accordingly post this scenario so that we can continue to achieve our ambitions through inspiring generations, continue to invest in the game. We were putting 60% more money in 2020 than we were in 2019 into the county network. And clearly, some of that revenue is impacted through what's happening to our country at the moment.
Okay. What's the relationship been like with the players? I mean, the realities are that your sport is quite a top-heavy sport. A lot of the income generation is at the top of the game, and then feeds down in a probably a more open way and a more sort of a more sort of fair way, maybe to a certain extent, than say football. Has that same approach been sort of mirrored in the relationship with the players? How have they seen their sort of wage situation?
I think we've had a very open and transparent dialogue with the players. We have a good relationship with the players, both directly and through their representatives, which for the men is a trust called the Team England Player Partnership, and for the England women's players is the England Women's Player Partnership. And these effectively are the bodies that negotiate on behalf of those player contracts. We've got a 5-year agreement with both of those entities, and we're negotiating with them to ensure that we give the transparency on the situation that we're facing as to the extent that we can at the moment, give clarity on that situation. And I've been heartened by the response from players, both in terms of their contribution from men and women, in terms of their contribution back into the ECB, in terms of helping us face this crisis. But over and above that, their attitude and help towards helping workers on the front line. We've got NHS volunteers amongst our playing group. There's been an awful lot of activity around trying to raise money. You may have noticed Joss Butler raffling off his World Cup winning shirt for his local NHS hospital. There's been an awful lot of activity like that, which has helped, I think, paint cricket in the right light, and will continue to make those representations to both TEP and to EWPP as the situation develops. But the contribution to date has amounted to, for the men, a 20% pay reduction for the first 3 months. So that's April, May and June. And for the women, it's a 10% salary cut. But on top of that, you have to add in the loss of income for the women's 100 competition, which all England centrally contracted women were set to benefit from.
Okay, thank you. Giles Watling. Can we?
Hearing today, but I wasn't quick enough with my pen. What did you call it? A profit project on the 100, was it?
Yeah, let me say it again. Look, at a time like this, when we are facing enormous pressure on finances, it seems to me even more important that we focus on the areas of the game that are going to generate interest, audience, and commercial revenue. Especially with the weight of evidence that we had behind the 100, in terms of its, in terms of the ticket sales, in terms of the traction that the competition was getting in the very audience we were setting out to get it. I understand there is significant resistance to the 100, and there has been for 2 years, but that does not make it a bad idea, nor does it make it an idea that's not likely to succeed. And we will put even more effort into the 100 post this crisis, because I think cricket will desperately need, in a hugely competitive landscape post-COVID, we will need to pull every lever to ensure that cricket remains relevant in a society that has so much choice.
And the whole idea about one of the ideas behind the 100 I've been reading is, of course, to open it up to fresh audiences. Out of the 170,000 tickets you sold, do you think that you did achieve that, or was it the old audiences coming again?
Well, the evidence that we've got, Mr. Watling, through the data that came in behind those ticket sales, is that indeed it was largely under 40s, with the intention of bringing children to those events as in some cases, a first opportunity to see live cricket. That is precisely the kind of audience that we were after. But let me be clear about something. We are heavily reliant, of course, on cricket's existing audience as well for the 100. We're trying to use the 100 is going to help us. It's going to help us sustain and care for all the things that we care about in cricket: our county institutions, long forms of cricket, test cricket, 4-day championship cricket. The more we can create a groundswell of audience that is representative of our country, multicultural, diverse, men and women, boys and girls from all different parts of the country, the better prepared we will be to sustain our wonderfully diverse sport in this country with all its weird and wonderful formats. That is the job of the ECB, and we make sure.
As you say, it has, of course, been controversial, but you're regarding it as an add-on rather than sucking away from the traditional forms of cricket.
I'm regarding it as absolutely essential in the plan to grow cricket in this country over the next 5 years and beyond.
Right. Now, moving on, the ECB said that the competition will make a profit. But is it correct that it'll only make a profit if you exclude the 1.3 million payment guaranteed every year to each county?
Yeah, but the 1.3 million every year to each county is a dividend. It's not part of the P&L of the tournament. That is part of the deal, if you like, that was done with counties to give the ECB permission to create a new tournament with all the objectives sitting behind it. It is not linked to the P&L. It is a dividend, which is a crucial part of the agreement that we have with first-class counties to deliver inspiring generations, the strategy for the game, into 18 first-class counties around the country.
So the figures do stack up, even including that dividend?
the figures stack up because the profit, the 100 gives us an opportunity not only to generate a positive P&L year on year from year one, which is the only short form tournament in the world to do that outside the IPL, by the way, but also generates a potential diversification of our revenues in the future. And one of the things that COVID-19 has brought to us is some thinking that was happening anyway, but I think the urgency behind this thinking now needs to accelerate about what does cricket's business model look like going forward. At the moment, we are very heavily to the tune of 3/4 of our revenue comes from media rights support from one broadcaster. That is anyone looking at a business plan for the long-term health of a sport will be looking at that number and thinking that is a big risk. The 100 helps us look at different ways of diversifying our revenue in the future and keeping safe, therefore, and securing the long-term future of 18 first-class counties, of a healthy recreational game, and of cricket for young people in this country.
And you say that the 100 isn't a gamble, and it's, to be absolutely fair, nobody could see COVID-19 coming to bite us all in the backside. But setting aside COVID-19 just briefly, and the effects it's having, do you think it's ethical for the ECB executives to take bonuses when the outcome of the 100 is far from certain?
I don't believe that bonuses are going to be a problem, if you like. I think we've all, the cost reduction program that has been introduced through the ECB is in place. Every employee of the ECB is taking a pay cut. Bonuses are awarded at the end of financial year. We're in the 3rd month of our financial year, just into the 4th month of our financial year. It's obviously going to be an exceptionally difficult financial year. And therefore, I think all bonuses are obviously have a huge question mark against them. And I would not support at this point even 1 penny being paid in bonuses to any employee of the ECB at such a time.
That's interesting. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Damien Green.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to move on from the 100 to Test cricket in the short term. Is it right to assume that your best hope of rescuing anything from this summer is to play some Test matches behind closed doors to get the TV income? And how many would you hope to be able to play?
It's a good question, Mr. Green, because you're quite right that our ability to mitigate the potential financial impact does require us to try when it's safe to do so, and only obviously when it's safe to do so with government support and with all the key measures that behind closed doors will mean for players, for staff, for broadcast media staff in venues. It is going to help us fill that hole, albeit we are staring at a 100 million plus loss this year, whatever happens. I think the ability for us to play Test match cricket is further complicated by the fact that obviously we're bringing, by very nature, you're bringing in teams from other parts of the world. This year, the West Indies are due to come, Pakistan are due to come, India and South Africa are due to come and play against our England women's team. And we've got Ireland coming and Australia for a white ball series against England men later in the summer. So the complexities of lockdown in those nations, which in the West Indies is 8 other countries that are potentially having to be thought through in terms of those lockdown measures in those countries. Clearly, there's a huge amount of complexity in respect of the plans that we put in place to bring teams over, to follow government guidelines, to get teams fit and ready to take the field to play international cricket. That is a long process, and it's one that involves excessive communication with players to get them comfortable for the very reasons that Mr. Parry was saying earlier about ensuring that players feel safe and ready to play at that time, if and when it's appropriate to do so.
So at what stage are those plans then? I mean, we've heard football is hoping to come back in some form in June. If you get some kind of green light to start, I mean, obviously you're planning now to to play some cricket towards the back end of June through July and August, how many test matches might you be able to fit in?
So we have draft schedules, as I'm sure you'll be aware. There's an enormous amount of work going on with looking at as many different scenarios as possible. So look, we've already stated there will be no professional cricket in this country before July the 1st. That is the earliest possible date that we're even planning towards, and we're obviously we're not planning on playing a test match on the 1st of July. But there are some significant lead times in terms of getting players fit and ready, of getting venues and pitches ready, which are and the process of assessing which venues in our country are best suited to deliver behind closed doors cricket in line with the government guidelines as and when they are agreed. All of those questions need to be answered. But if I tell you that a fast bowler, for example, will need between 6 and 7 weeks from now, having been in lockdown at home for a period of time, it's 6 or 7 weeks before that bowler is fit and ready to take the field in an international match. So that's just the training elements. Obviously, you've got all the other logistical elements, including bringing overseas teams over and providing the same level of preparation for overseas teams. It's a very complex scenario, but with the following wind, we hopefully will be able to play a significant number of test matches this summer, which will help us mitigate those financial losses that we're facing at the moment.
Do you have any conception yet of what's the upper end of the sort of percentage of income that you would normally expect that you could get in? And allied to that, presumably some things will have to go by the board. What's at the bottom of the tree? What do you know is not going to get funded that you would like to fund?
I think at this point, Mr. Green, it's really very, very early to make those assessments. We have made some early redrafts of our strategy on the basis of a worst case scenario. We haven't got to the end of those discussions yet. As I'm sure you're aware, they're complex and they involve every budget line in the game. What we're looking at, however, is a scenario where if we build out our worst case scenario and we do get some cricket this summer, we are able to start to build back some of those revenue streams, to reopen those revenue streams, then the situation can get better from that point. But I don't want to hide away from the fact that this is, our ability to protect the cricket network is going to be significantly hampered by what happens this year, and it is a real concern, right down to participation. One of my major concerns, and indeed the ECB's board's major concerns, is having a summer where no cricket at recreational level is played is a massive concern for us. And we would like to think that we can work with government as and when it's safe to do so. If children are able to go back to school and the government allow that to happen, and with all the social distancing guidelines that are in place, and if it's safe to do so, we believe we can work with government to enable junior cricket to be played with coaches outdoors, according to social distancing rules that are likely to be in place. We're a non-contact sport and we feel we can do that.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Just one final question for you, just following on from what Damien's asked you. Can you assure the committee that if you are having to make some difficult decisions over the next year or 2 years, that women's and girls' cricket will not pay the price, and that you would effectively ring-fence them, considering the way in which one of the great developments in this country over the last few years in the game of cricket has been the explosion of interest in women's and girls' cricket?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Chair. I think that ultimately nothing about COVID-19 and the implications of COVID-19 dilutes our ambition or our vision for the future of cricket in this country. And that is very definitely a gender-balanced game, building on the great work that's been done through the growth of the women's game and the growth of women's sport in this country. We have taken steps in 2020 to open up 8 new regional hubs for the women's game. There are obviously implications for COVID-19 on the short term. All of the activities that were set to be generated this summer around those regional hubs is obviously conflicted now and is complex, but there is no question about ongoing ambition and commitment to the women's game going forward.
Sorry, Tom, will you ring fence the money, yes or no?
Well, I think at the moment, I don't think in my position I can sit here without knowing the full impact of COVID-19, but looking at staring down the barrel at 380 million pounds of losses, we can say to any part of the game that you'll be ring fenced, because it would be wholly irresponsible for me to do so. But I can give you the absolute assurance, however, that we will do whatever we can and whatever is in our power. And there is a huge lobby of support across the game and across the ECB board to protect women's cricket and indeed the recreational game. So I can give you that assurance that there'll be the full weight of that support, and we'll make announcements about those plans as soon as we can, which will hopefully be that ring fencing of revenues. But I cannot give the committee a guarantee.
Yeah. We politicians like ring fencing, as you can imagine. Most manifestos contain it. Giles Watling, just one final cue, and then we'll move on to the next witness.
Yes, one tiny one for you, Mr. Harrison. What is the ECB doing to protect clubs at the grassroots? Have you any plans in train? Because I know from personal experience that some of them are really teetering on the edge, doing the best they can, but they need help from above.
Yeah, it's a great question, Mr. Watling. And look, we've put a series of packages in place to try and help clubs. We've been benefiting from at least 100 clubs, for example, have benefited from the business rates exemption, which has been used by every county. There's only about 100 cricket clubs that benefit from that. We've got 2,000 clubs that are benefiting from the small business grants system. There have been some issues with that, with clubs that are listed as community amateur sports clubs. They don't qualify for those loans, so government help around that. In some local borough councils are not awarding those loans to clubs who fit in that category. That's a bit of an issue for us. We've got about 4,000 clubs that don't qualify anyway for that, and those clubs have in quite substantial numbers applied for either Sport England loans, Sport Wales loans in Wales, or ECB loans, and about £2 million has been given out through those loans, through those various loan schemes. And there's a bit of a lag on those numbers as that process of agreeing those loans comes through.
You're outlining there what the government's doing. I wonder what the ECB are doing. Are you offering advice on it?
Part of that is an ECB, effectively the freeing of the ECB trust reserves that the England Wales Cricket Trust reserves that have been have some reserves that have been able to help with those loans, with funding those loans. We've also taken, it might seem a small point, but it's a very important point. We've recently approved the purchase of all cricket balls across all leagues in the country, which is a major expense item and is a multi-million-pound spend across the country. So we've done that as well. But look, we recognise that there are, and my local club here is no different. There's a huge appeal to local members to help support a club at a time where they'd normally be generating revenues from junior cricket programs, from member subscriptions, and all of those really critical revenue streams. And of course, the match day income, which for local cricket clubs is very important. That's also not happening. So there's no amount we can do to sustain the size of the hole that is likely to be out there. We've estimated that at being around £32 million around the country. It's a very, very serious problem.
No, just keep focused on it. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Harrison, for your evidence today. I'm now going to call our third witness, Bill Sweeney, the Chief Executive Officer of the Rugby Football Union. Before handing to Julie Elliott, I've just got a couple of very quick questions for you, Mr. Sweeney. Have you made an assessment of the worst case scenario in terms of there's no games being played in 2020? And have you made a sort of assessment of the economic impact of that and the effect on the future of the game?
Yes, we have. We negotiated and managed through the initial phase of the crisis quite well, but one of the hallmarks of this crisis is the need to continually scenario plan and look at the various different outcomes. we'll have a reduction in revenue of 15 million through to the end of our financial year this year, which ends in June. And then we're looking at 3 potential scenarios through to the end of our next financial year in 21. If the autumn internationals go ahead in November, which are key for us, they're a major revenue generator, but we're assuming certain declines in spectator attendance. But if the autumn internationals go ahead, we'll still lose something like 32 million in revenue through to the end of the next financial year. If the internationals go ahead, but they're behind closed doors, that will be a negative impact of 85 million. And if the games are cancelled entirely, that will be 107 million on top of the 15 we've already lost. So it's a very significant loss in revenue, and we're doing what we can to mitigate it.
And I imagine a worst case scenario so that you really do have to take account of, because your sport is a very physical sport, and I can imagine that there are great difficulties in terms of resuming. We're hearing the Premier League is hoping to resume sometime in June. Do you have any idea when you think you can resume, or is there any sort of particular sort of circumstances you think you have to take account of?
We sit on a number of working groups, medical working groups, and our chief medical officer is represented on that, on a working group that deals with DCMS on a regular basis as well. You're absolutely right. I mean, our game relies upon contact. We're a contact sport. We're also a highly socially interactive sport, so mass gatherings are important for us. 55% of our revenue comes from ticketing and hospitality. So the ability to get up to some form of normality around mass gatherings is key. It's very difficult to predict it at this time. We also sit on a body with professional rugby, with PRL, where the Rugby Players Association are also represented there as well. And we're looking at various different scenarios around testing protocols, around how you can create biosecure environments and how quickly we could return to play.
Right, thank you. Julie Elliott.
Good morning, Bill. You've outlined the financial impact as a whole if rugby isn't played this year, but what in terms, could you identify for us what in terms of the men's game, the women's game and the grassroots game would be by the end of the year if no rugby is being played?
Yeah, it's our major concern. It's our number one concern. The grassroots and the community game is the heartbeat of our game. It's the lifeblood. It's what supplies the players through into the international pathway. And it's absolutely critical for us. When we saw the crisis emerging on the 16th of March, we paused the game till April. We had an overwhelming reaction from the game and also from the Championship League, who said, look, can you bring the season to a close, because we want some certainty in terms of how we manage our own finances. So we closed the season on the 20th of March. We went into lockdown on the 23rd of March. We then proposed pay cuts to the organisation on the 25th of March, and we also launched our 7 million support fund on the same day. And then we accessed the furloughing system from government, which has been a massive help for us on the 27th of March, I think it was. It's been quite rewarding to see that the clubs and the community game, by and large, is in very good shape. It's a well-managed community game. They immediately went into lockdown themselves, mothballed their operations, and we were surprised at the relatively small number of clubs that were in very severe distress that we needed to focus on. That's the positive side of things. Against our loan, we have a loan of just over 5 million, of which the first 6 months there's a repayment back holiday, and then there's a 0% interest over 3 years. We've only had, if only is the right word, we've only had 79 applications for that loan currently, which is very similar to the 78 clubs that have applied for the Community Emergency Fund from Sport England. But we do expect, as we go through this period now of maximum revenue generation for the grassroots clubs, we expect that to increase as they start going through the summer and are looking to restart rugby whenever that may be.
Thank you. And we've talked so far about if rugby isn't played till the end of this year, but if we move forward, as the chair said, it is the contact sport of contact sports. If we move forward, perhaps to say that rugby isn't played till the summer of 2021, could you outline where the game would be by that point?
That would be catastrophic. 85% of our revenues comes from hosting the men's international games at Twickenham. Twickenham is a major asset for us, where if you compare to the Southern Hemisphere, most of the Southern Hemisphere teams don't own their own stadiums. We tend to in the Northern Hemisphere. So when you own a stadium like that, it's a major cost, but at the same time, you can generate a tremendous amount of revenue from that. Hence the importance of the autumn internationals taking place in November. If this was to be prolonged and go through into the summer of next year, and the Six Nations games are impacted, then it would be a catastrophic impact on rugby union in England. All of the money we generate is spent back into the professional game and into the community game. So we'd be looking at some very severe situations there, and we'd be needing additional levels of support.
And can you comment on the women's game, because you haven't mentioned that so far?
Yeah, the women's game remains a major priority for us. We've just expanded the Tyrrell's top tier 15s competition in England. We have England players centrally contracted in the women's league, as you know. We're spending just short of 5 million on the women's game, and we see the women's game not just in the international context, but the growth of the women's game is a key component to help us support the grassroots game overall for various different reasons. So we want to maintain that, but at the same time that the situation we find ourselves in, it's very difficult to plan with any degree of certainty when we don't know what the outcome is. We don't know if we'll be playing internationals in November. We don't know if they'll be behind closed doors. We don't know if they'll be against Southern Hemisphere opposition or Northern Hemisphere opposition. So we're mapping out all the various different scenarios. Our priority is to support the women's game, but it will come under the scrutiny of same as every single area of investment that we have within the game.
Thank you. And can finally I ask if in the two scenarios of rugby not playing till the end of this year or summer next year, what help, if any, the government could give you against the backdrop of not being able to say when the game is going to start again? Is there anything extra you think the government could do to support the sport of rugby union?
Well, we'd like to thank the government first off for the initiatives that were put in place very quickly, alongside of the action that we took at the RFU, the VAT deferral, the business rates holiday, and particular salary retention scheme were incredibly important for us. I mentioned that we activated the furlough scheme after the pay cut proposals on the 27th of March, and over 60% of our staff are currently furloughed. If we are indeed one of the last cabs off the rank in terms of being able to play rugby again because of the unique characteristics of the sport, then we'd like to see some support in terms of an extension of that furloughing program. We'd also like consideration around furloughed workers being able to return to work on a part-time basis. But if we get into a situation where we're talking about Six Nations matches in February, March of next year being impacted, then there's a limit to what we can do independently in terms of our financing capability. We would have to be coming to government for some kind of support.
Thank you, Bill. Thanks.
Watling.
Thank you, Chair. There are many organisations struggling really financially around the world. I believe in America, USA Rugby's filed for bankruptcy, etc. I mean, is this something that could be on the cards for the RFU?
No, our financial model is inherently strong. We have a strong balance sheet. Owning Twickenham in its entirety is a very positive situation for us. We're a business model that generates cash. What we're going through now is a situation that I don't think anything we've experienced previously could have prepared us for how you manage this. So we're going through a period now of really trying to make sure we're not spending any money we don't have to spend. It's all about liquidity. When we realised that we were going to lose something like £15 million of revenue through to the end of this financial year, we implemented a series of cost reductions, which we managed to claw back about 13 million of that, but that's gone now. So as we look forward now into the next year, we're looking to target something between 20 and 25 million pounds worth of savings as we manage our way through this crisis. It will not be a short-term issue. I hear a lot of people saying we'll get back to rugby, we'll get back to playing sport later in the year, and things will be fine. We'll have the Six Nations next year, and off we go. But we're working in terms of 4, 5, maybe even a 6-year recovery plan to be able to get us back fully on our feet. But we're not in a similar situation to has been outlined about the US and potentially Australia.
With those figures you just gave me, you just said that, and I've just done it in my head, and I might have got it wrong, but that still leaves a 13 million gap that you're looking for. Where would you find that?
So if you take our first financial year through to the end of June 2019, so that was the 15 million revenue shortfall, and we've clawed back about 13 million of that. So if you look at our financial year ending next month, we're actually not in bad situation.
That's good to hear.
Then project forward. If you then go forward into the next financial year ending in June 21, if we have no rugby played whatsoever, that will be a further 107 million pounds worth of revenue lost, and there's a limit to how many savings we can mitigate that with. So we're targeting between 20 and 25 million pounds of savings.
No, thank you. And finally, is there something that the DCMS could do for you that it's not doing? Can you outline that?
DCMS has been incredibly helpful. I think I mentioned just before to Ms. Elliott, the VAT deferral, the business rates holiday, the salary retention scheme in particular has been really helpful for us. Being able to furlough 60% of our staff when no rugby is taking place has been a major benefit. If we continue to go through the summer and through into the potential start of the next season and we're still not playing any rugby, an extension of the salary retention scheme for us would be very important, and the ability to perhaps bring those workers back on a part-time basis.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Kevin Brennan.
Thank you very much, Chair. Mr. Sweeney, you said to me earlier about possibly playing the autumn internationals with a limited attendance rather than with no attendance. I think you said there'd be a loss of 32 million if that happened. Does that mean you're thinking about having about 32,000 people in the stadium for a game like that, on my rough calculation?
No, the 32 million reduction in revenue is across a range of different areas. It's not just purely to do with ticketing. We don't know at this stage how many people will be allowed to host at Twickenham if the games go ahead in November.
So that calculation isn't based on a particular assumption of how many you might be able to get into the stadium?
It's based on some very rough assumptions around possible declines in other revenue streams. It's based on an assumption that it's unlikely at that stage that we'll have a full return to full capacity.
But it's based on an assumption you get some ticket sales, obviously. So there must be some rough number in there of how many people you think it might be.
It's very difficult to predict what's a mass event and what's a mass gathering and what's not. You know, is it 100 people? Is it 10,000 people? Is it 30,000 people? Yeah, it's certainly not going to be 82,000.
Sure, but we must assume it's something like 20 or 30,000 on the figures you've told us so far.
Well, there are other revenue lines that we're looking at as well. So there's sponsorship lines, there's broadcast lines, and we're looking at both of those, not just ticketing.
Okay. You're not going to give me a number. I can see that. So can I just press you a little bit on the Six Nations? Do you think that's done for this year now, and there's no chance of it being completed?
It all depends how quickly we can return to play. So at the moment, the assumptions are that the remaining games in the Six Nations will be played in October and November. We're still aiming towards that scenario.
Right. And you could fit those in with the autumn internationals as well at the same time.
Yes, we've worked with World Rugby, we've worked with Six Nations, and the intention is to be able to schedule those in October and November.
Right. And on that point, can I just ask you about the Six Nations television negotiations? Because as you know, the committee's taken an interest in that. Where are we with all of that, and how's the has the coronavirus crisis had an impact on those discussions?
I think, like most other business dealings, negotiations, or whatever, it's on pause. It hasn't been cancelled, but we are right in the middle of a tender bid at the moment, so the timing isn't great.
Which union is the most hawkish about taking it behind a paywall, would you say?
I don't think I could give you an answer in terms of any one union. I think all the unions are in the same position in terms of being in a tough place, in the sense that we want to see the game taken to the widest possible audience. But again, as been brought about by the COVID situation, we need to maximise the potential commercial revenue out of that.
In the longer term, do you think it's wise to do what cricket did effectively and take the game's great historic shop window away from mass audiences?
We find ourselves in that very difficult situation of wanting to have the largest number of the population watching the games, and we get something like 9 million watch the Six Nation games on free-to-air as we had last season. But at the same time, as highlighted by the COVID situation, we need to maximise the possible revenue that we can achieve. If there's any disruption to that competitive tender process, then we think, say for example, it was to go free-to-air in November this year, then it would cost us an additional 10 million on top of the projections there.
And that was the argument made, wasn't it, around cricket? And you end up with a healthy hand at the end of a withered arm with that approach, don't you? And it really affects the game downstream.
Yeah, I can't really speak for cricket in terms of how that operated, but ideally we'd like to see some kind of balanced outcome from this.
Can I ask you about CVC and their investment in the game and what that means for the game? And where do you think this is all leading? Are we going to see a big restructuring of the game after this, with these finances coming in after this crisis? And is there any possibility, you think, that, I know this is not directly your responsibility, but this might lead towards the development of a British and Irish league at club level?
think that there are so many different conversations going on about various permutations and the direction the game could go in. I think there are certain, and yourself as a rugby fan, you'll know there are certain fault lines that have existed in the game probably going back to 1995 that have been addressed. We think that this crisis presents a unique opportunity to address those now. Perhaps the biggest one is an alignment of the global calendar, where we can eliminate the overlap between the club game and the international game, have clarity for the fans in the domestic market, but also find a way to align with the Southern Hemisphere so we come together.
Has Bill Beaumont's re-election made that more or less likely that that could be achieved, do you think?
I think the two manifestos were very similar. It was a question more of style, but the two manifestos were similar. We've already done a huge amount of work on the global alignment. One of the things that came out of the crisis very early on was, well, I'm relatively new, but I'm being told it's the highest level of collaboration between North and Southern Hemisphere ever. And I think we're close to being able to come up with something in discussion with the professional clubs as well, and the clubs have been involved in giving their input, that we could find a solution to this, which has plagued us for a long time.
Could I ask you one final question, and that is, there's a lot of talk at the moment about Saudi money coming into sport, certainly with the Newcastle United proposal. There's also money going into live events in things like Live Nation in the music industry and so on. Clearly, there's a lot of money in the Saudi sovereign fund. Has there been any approach, as far as you're aware of, in relation to rugby of investing in the game from that quarter?
No, that's the first time I've heard of it. Well, that's not the first time I've heard of Saudi money being invested in sport, but I haven't heard of any approaches from that side towards rugby.
And if they were to approach, is that something you would welcome or be concerned about?
I think we'd look at what's the best interests of rugby first and foremost. I think we're very fortunate to have a unique game, and what's been shown through this crisis is the tremendous values and the spirit at the community level. And the community level and what we do in the professional level, the international game has to be linked in together. So we wouldn't want to do anything which would disrupt or undermine the community game in any sense. And we'd look at anything very carefully.
And I think that's something we can agree on. It's a values-based game. Thank you very much, Mr. Sweeney. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Sweeney, for your evidence today. And thank you to all the witnesses who've taken part in our first panel. We're now going to break for a couple of moments in order basically to set up the second panel. But please stay on the line. Order, order.
Hello, Katherine.
Hi there. I can hear you.
Hello, good to see you. It's the Parliamentary Broadcasting Unit. Pleasure to meet you. We're going to be restarting quite soon. The chair's just popped out. I'll just pop into his chair to say hello. Hang on a sec. Sorry,
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Yeah, fine, thanks.
Okay, guys, so if during the session one of you's talking and the other one wants to interject, this is probably not going to happen because I get the feeling it'll be one at a time, Tim first and then Katherine. But if there is something you want to raise, just raise your hands and Chair will be able to see you. Okay, and you can both keep your mics unmuted. We will mute everything back here in Parliament.
Perfect, thank you.
Great, thank you. We will be with you shortly. Just hang fire.
Order. This is the second panel in our hearing on the impact of COVID-19 on sport. Taking part in this panel will be Tim Hollingsworth, OBE, the Chief Executive of Sport England, and Dame Katherine Grainger, the Chair of UK Sport. Our first witness will be Mr. Hollingsworth. Good morning. Is it morning? Yes, it's still morning, Mr. Hollingsworth. Good morning, Mr. Hollingsworth.
Good morning, Chair. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for agreeing to take part. So, just in terms of the current situation in terms of sports clubs across the country, can you just paint a picture in terms of the help they're receiving, the challenges they're facing?
Yes, certainly. Thank you. I mean, you recognised from some of the earlier session that while there's a huge focus on the professional games and the elite element of our sports and those that are reliant on professional leagues, actually the foundation stones and the heartlands of our sports are the community clubs, and indeed that extends beyond the traditional affiliated sports with the governing bodies to those that are also in our communities now using sport as a very powerful way of engaging local communities. What we've seen, of course, because as you would expect, as with every aspect of society, those clubs have very quickly ceased to have any activity whatsoever. There are about 72,000 affiliated clubs, that's sports clubs that are related to national governing bodies, perhaps half as many again of clubs that use sport in their local communities. So we're talking about a very, very sizable impact on local community grassroots sport. And it's absolutely essential for us that we try, I hope, in this period to sustain as many of those as we possibly can, working with the governing bodies. You've heard from both cricket and rugby this morning about the work they're doing to sustain their clubs. But I think in addition, we recognise from a Sport England perspective that they are an essential part of the nation's activity. They're an essential part of our local communities. And so we've looked to support them as best we can.
Thank you. Damien Hines.
Thank you, Chair. And Mr. Hollingsworth, on the subject of that support, so you've put together with government this support package of £195 million.
Yes.
Within that, the Community Emergency Fund, we understand, is oversubscribed quite heavily. How are you going to deal with that? How are you going to allocate the money that's there? Will you be able to get further money to support community clubs?
Yes, thank you. I mean, you're absolutely right. The 195 million package that we announced, actually that was published 8 days after the lockdown, was very much geared towards doing two things. On the one hand, we know that we rely on a sort of set of core partners, if you like, national partners in sport, the governing bodies, the active partners that exist in 43 regions of each county in England, and many other national bodies as well. And what we could do for them was to provide some immediate stability in terms of, first of all, allowing them greater flexibility on our existing investments as Sport England, and secondly, looking to provide for them a certainty of a one-year rollover of that so they can plan with some degree of at least immediate certainty. What we also recognise, though, that would be much more immediate need in our local communities, and therefore, as you say, one of the key interventions that we put forward was the initial £20 million Community Emergency Fund, alongside other planned investments that added up to 80 million of new money for Sport England from our previous level of investment. We are oversubscribed, you're right. It's been indicative, I think, probably as much as anything else that is out there, of the immediate level of crises that has hit our sport and physical activity sector. We have normally two open funds, our Community Asset Fund and our Small Grants Fund. They too run to a budget annually of about 20 million, and normally over a year we would expect to get about 4,000 applications to that fund. In the last 5 weeks, we've had over 7,500 applications to the Community Emergency Fund. So that tells the story of how much the local clubs are in need of that immediate support. We've got over 50 people working full time in terms of assessing those applications. There are some criteria, which means not every application will be successful. We're in fact finding that about 3/4 of the applications are meeting the criteria and therefore able to receive some funds. And we have to think now about what we can do in relation, as you say, to that oversubscription. We are looking at what we can do ourselves in terms of an extension of funding there. both from our existing lottery balance and resources as Sport England. We're very conscious that our money is there to support the local and community sports sector. But also we do have a further fund of 20 million about to go on stream, which is even more geared towards local clubs and communities and trying to help those particularly who are working in those areas of higher social economic deprivation and who are playing roles in terms of really engaging people who previously didn't have activity as part of their lives. And we're going to work that slightly differently, less as an open fund, more using expert partners who understand those environments and understand those localities to help us distribute it. So we do think, Mr. Hines, that we probably have to look at extending, and indeed there's an opportunity to consider that in the coming days. But at the same time, it's reflecting on the role of the emergency fund versus the other programs that we put in place to support sport now and hopefully over the months to come.
So just to be clear, that £20 million you were just talking about is a separate and second £20 million,
yes.
Which is
so
outside of the 195 package.
No, that's inclusive of part of the 195. So if I break it down very briefly so the committee's aware, that figure relates to about 5 different elements of investment. The first and most immediate one, and we launched it as an open fund on the day that we announced the total package, was the Community Emergency Fund that's supporting our local clubs, an open fund to which they can apply for up to £10,000 worth of immediate relief. And that will be going on very, very immediate needs, anything from paying the bills that they have outstanding, keeping their facilities in some order, potentially making up for lost revenue from very critical events that were coming up in the next 2 or 3 months. In addition to that, we have a short-term £5 million pot for partners in the sports system who had very immediate short-term need. And some of those could be sports and other governing bodies that we don't automatically fund, but who in this period were still going to be finding it very difficult to survive. Then the next stage of that is what I just sort of suggested is coming on stream in the next few days, which is a further 20 million of investment into our local communities. We've learned a lot strategically in the last few years about how understanding local communities and a sense of place in our investment can really help to reach people who perhaps previously weren't so well served by the traditional sport sector and traditional sport landscape. So in that respect, we know that we can work with organisations. Each of you in your constituencies will have an active partner for that region. They'll be working across that area and knows who the best organisations are to reach out to. Equally, there are brilliant locally driven organisations like Street Games or Sported and others in that field who understand local communities and how sport is playing a role in those local communities. We will invest that 20 million more through those organisations rather than having it as an open fund. But the combination of the emergency fund and the community fund will, I think, be at least able to get that 40 million to the places where it's needed most quickly. The remainder, which is about a £35 million fund, is split into 2. We do have a £5 million pot at the moment, which we're suggesting we can and should think about using as we start to really learn the lessons of this period to help organisations think innovatively about activity. And I'm sure we'll come on to what's possible now and what we think might be possible in the weeks and months to come. Because there is some good innovation already taking place, not least around the way that organisations are now thinking about using online platforms and digital activity more effectively. And then lastly, the 30 million that's left of the 80, and I hope that's all added up to an 80 million pot so far, good, thank you, is one that we absolutely recognise that while we have an immediate need, there will also be fundamentally the requirement to help our organisations, our sports, our governing bodies, and others to come back to an environment where they are helping people to play again. And in that environment, it won't be simple. There will be costs involved there, undoubtedly, and we would look to allocate that 30 million there. The remainder, which is the 115 million, is that essential cost of the rollover that I described for the 120 or so organisations that we know are our absolute core partners, our absolute sort of ecosystem, if you like, on which the whole of sport in this country relies. I think it added up, and I hope that made sense in terms of the breakdown. The immediate need, the emergency fund, the community fund, is the 40 million that we're looking to put into the system now.
Yes, thank you. What do we actually know about levels of exercise happening during this crisis period and how that varies between different groups in society, and particularly among children?
We do ourselves know a reasonable amount of the first 4 weeks of what we've experienced. You'll be familiar, I know, from your previous role with the Active Life survey that Sport England has traditionally held over the last 3-4 years, which is the largest survey of activity levels in England by far. That survey last reported quite recently, but was for up until last November. And that showed us that actually we had record levels of activity overall in this country. We were seeing nearly, well, slightly over 1 million people being more active against the Chief Medical Officer's definition than we had seen at the start of the cycle. So we could see a position where more and more people were being active in their lives. But within that, even before the COVID crisis, that was showing some inequalities that we recognized were pretty stubborn. That there was certainly an inequality still around gender, although through This Girl Can and many other campaigns to drive women's sport, heard about that again from cricket and rugby this morning, that gap is undoubtedly closing. There were some definite challenges around disability and disabled people's activities, not least because we weren't best placed as a system, I think, to help and support them. Although again, in the last set of survey figures from Active Lives, we were seeing some improvement there. There are some interesting but also very worrying inequalities around ethnicity and the way that that actually is a determining factor in people's level of activity. But the biggest one overall and a consistent inequality was socially economic. It was the economic circumstances that people found themselves in that tended to indicate their levels of activity. And I say by all of that by way of preface, because we've held weekly surveys, 2,000 people, adults 16 plus, since the crisis began, doing that through Savanta Comrades. And those patterns have fundamentally not really shifted. So overall, I'm delighted that we have seen activity levels on the whole sort of be largely maintained. But I think we are within that as well, seeing people recognizing the importance of physical activity to their physical and mental well-being. And I think that's a key factor in this current environment. But we have seen those inequalities maintained, and in some ways they've started to worsen. And I think particularly if I were to point out your point about younger people and children, and I know you were very familiar with this in your time as Secretary of State, we are in a position where, relatively speaking, we do not have active young people in the way that we would want to see. That in particular, you have about a third of children who are not doing the recommended Chief Medical Officer's amount of activity per week. That figure is getting worse in the current environment. We now think that it's about 44% of children are either doing no activity or less than half an hour's activity every day in the current crisis. So on top of what's happening in the adult population, which is a genuine maintenance of activity as a whole, we've seen indeed some positives. I don't know if any of the committee members now ride a bike or go for a run more regularly and frequently than they might have done before. But we hope and think that there are some great habits forming in terms of people's daily activity now. We've tried very hard through our Join the Movement campaign, which has got a hashtag to stay in and work out, to show what's possible in the home. There are some people, I don't think Joe Wicks needs any more publicity than he's already getting, but there are some people who've really demonstrated what's possible in the home. But at the same time, we are concerned that as the weeks go on, that activity level is maintained, and that the inequalities that we see in everyday life, if you like, are being maintained in terms of what we're seeing across the country.
And obviously, you know, different people have different opportunities and restrictions on what it is possible to do. Do you think there's a role for any kind of evolution of advice on exercise while lockdown is in place? And as lockdown gets eased, what are your priorities for that in terms of exercise and participatory sport?
Thank you. I think it's a great question, and I would split it into the two as you did. I think now we were delighted, and I think it's to the government's credit that amidst the 4 areas to which that we were allowed to go out of the house at the start of the announcement of the lockdown guidelines in March, physical activity was one of them. That was not by any means the pattern across the world, and it certainly wasn't the pattern across some of our Western European countries. So right away, the understanding that activity mattered, I think, was hugely important. And I think that has led and has continued to drive a sense that it should be and can be a part of people's lives in a way that they previously possibly hadn't thought about. And actually that the benefit that you can receive from that, and we fundamentally believe from a Sport England perspective, that the reason why activity matters is because of the benefit primarily that it can bring to an individual in terms of their physical and their mental well-being. And I think we're seeing that being driven by people's approach to it now. As I say, alongside that, we've seen huge amounts of innovation online from people demonstrating what's possible. And I think that's possibly one lesson now that I think people can take forward when we hopefully see the opening up of sport that we can come onto. Because actually people are being more innovative and inventive about ways to be active. And I think there's a general more understanding that the importance here is people find something that works for them, not have something preordained imposed upon them. So that sense of permission around being active is being driven by the current circumstances to a degree. And we as Sport England would absolutely look to latch onto that. It's what's driven our previous campaigns, the We Are Undefeatable campaign for people with long-term health conditions, the This Girl Can campaign as part of addressing the activity levels of women and girls. And what's absolutely driving our Stay and Work Out campaign now, we don't see that as a prescriptive campaign in the slightest. It's about the opportunity that people can see for themselves about what's possible. I think when we come on to then what happens and we look forward to the opportunity for both, greater levels of activity and more organised sport to return, then I think we have to think again about what we've learned. We should absolutely latch on to some of the digital and online innovation that has taken place. We should absolutely fundamentally recognise that the principal driver of it is health and well-being, and that recognising that extending beyond the guidelines at any stage would be the absolute, an absolute detriment to people's health and well-being. And then for governing bodies, as we look at how sports could and should be reintroduced, are they really taking every opportunity to introduce their sport back in a safe way? Has the risk assessment of that been particularly robust? And most importantly of all, I think, are they being genuinely innovative and flexible about what that can be? And if we can get that right and communicate it effectively, then I hope we will see activity levels maintained. And critically, to your opening question, young people being engaged over the summer in a way to keep them active and make sure that we don't have a year of young people.
Okay.
Activity is not part of their lives.
Thank you, Mr. Hollingsworth. I'm going to move on now to our next question. Julia, I'll just say to you, we've got very limited time. Can you be as succinct as possible, please? With
yes, sorry.
Thank you. Very interesting, but succinct. Yeah. Julia Elliott.
Mr. Hollingsworth, I was going to ask you about how the This Girl campaign is happening under COVID, but you've alluded to it a little bit. I want to move on to, I do believe, and everything we're reading is women's sport is at an increased risk during this crisis. In fact, in women's football, FIFPro have said it's an existential threat to the women's game. AFC Flight have actually closed their women's team. So I'm very worried moving forward about what is going to happen right across the spectrum of women's sport. Is the organisation giving specific focus on women's sport to ensure that gender disparity in engagement of sport does not get worse after this crisis?
Yes.
And what are you doing? Briefly.
So yes, not that succinct. No, I do absolutely recognise the challenge that you're offering there, and I think it's a beholden on Sport England every bit as it is on any other organisation now to make sure that where we have seen and recognised inequalities, both at the
what are you actually doing in relation to COVID-19 to make sure this is going to happen?
Well, fundamentally through the two focus areas of our activity now, so the two priorities that we have made. One, which is to make sure that we are investing as much as we can of our existing exchequer and lottery resources to support organisations. For example, in the criteria around the emergency fund, it was made clear that there would be some prioritisation given to organisations supporting women's sport. The organisations that we've been funding over the last period and into the next year, absolutely, that funding has conditions attached to it, one of which is to be able to demonstrate their focus on women's sport. The Join the Movement campaign that we've kind of adapted what we've learned from This Girl Can, particularly for this period, fundamentally is demonstrating what's possible for women to do activity in the home, because we've recognised that in some cases, and I'm by no means, except that I'm generalising here, women are perhaps taking on more of the responsibility for childcare, more of the responsibility for homeschooling, alongside, in many cases, their professional career. On that basis, we need to be able to show that it's still possible to fit activity into your lives. So more generally, closing the gender gap has been a key priority for Sport England. In this period, it's absolutely about continuing to emphasise, both in our investments and in our messaging through the campaign, that it is a key priority, and that we would not want to see any step away from organisations seeking to offer sport to women. And just finally, and very quickly, when we come to talk to governing bodies about the one-year rollover and the investment there, one of the criteria will be still that they are supporting the women's games at grassroots.
Thank you.
One quick final question from Steve Bryan.
Tim, nice to see you again. Just very quickly, the link between mental health and exercise during the lockdown restrictions is important, we know. I just wonder whether you have any reflections on that, and whether you might include that within your next Active Life survey.
We do, Mr. Bryan. We do have a measure of the well-being in terms of mental health in active lives. But I think what we're also seeing in the surveys that we're doing weekly at the moment, that around 2/3 of people recognise that, as well as being good for their physical health and hoping to support their physical well-being, people also recognise the benefit to their mental health. I think in general, it's absolutely essential for us to recognise that one of the outcomes, the purposes of government and public investment in sport and physical activity, is to help people manage, maintain and improve their mental well-being. And we are absolutely geared around that as one of the 5 outcomes that DCMS and government have highlighted as being the purpose of investment into sport. And we have partnerships alongside our traditional partners with, for example, Mind and Rethink Mental Illness and various other charities who are focused around benefiting people and their mental health. So my assurance to you absolutely is that alongside physical well-being, and we hope also the integration and the sense of social worth that people get from their community clubs once it starts to reopen, that people will continue to understand the benefit of being active to their mental well-being.
Thank you.
Hollingsworth for appearing for us today. I'm now going to move to our final witness, Dame Katherine Grainger, the Chair of UK Sport. Good morning, Dame Katherine Grainger.
Good morning, Chair. Pleasure to be here. And may I say, it's a joy to have new faces on my daily video calls. So thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you. That's very nice of you to join us. The 2020 Olympics and Paralympics have been postponed. Could you just outline for the committee the effects of that on athletes in terms of their finances and also their sort of fitness, well-being, etc.?
Absolutely. The postponement of the Olympics and Paralympics was not unexpected. It was the right decision for the IOC and IPC to take, considering the health and welfare of all athletes around the globe. The biggest implications that we have seen at the moment is sport is effectively at a standstill, as much as we'd recognise. Every athlete that would have right now been 3 months away from the biggest event of their lives is isolated individually at home, trying to do some training, but not able to access the usual venues that they can. So in a very different world. The sports that support them, we know, are already in some financial risk, and the longer this situation goes on, will be in greater risk going forward. And it means that the risks going to the actual games next year is increasing. As far as UK sport is concerned, our sort of funding runs out at the end of March 2021, which obviously leaves a few months gap to leading up to the Olympic and Paralympic Games. And unless we know that's going to be filled, then the risks increase for everyone. So the athletes themselves are in a mixed place, as we've heard this morning from various different witnesses. It's a very individual situation. Some athletes have completely embraced the new opportunities it creates, some different training from homes, from some doing some great work with sort of through social media, trying to kind of work with society to help heal things there. But effectively, they're in a difficult position. But although the training has paused, as we've said, I think what's important is to say that the support around athletes haven't paused. They can still access the same doctors, psychologists, mental health professionals they've already always been able to access. And there's some digital platforms they can access as well to have any issues going forward. So as much as we can, we're protecting the athletes in this very difficult time.
What discussions going on between the government and yourselves and the sports and the athletes?
We've had, from day one, there's been very, very good discussions. I have to say, the crisis is a tragedy on every scale. What it has brought in a positive way is incredible collaboration across the high performance system. So every single sport, the British Olympic Association, the British Paralympic Association, all the home nation sports councils and UK Sport are speaking all the time to make sure that as much as positive as can be done to support the athletes and the teams going forward. We have very, very regular conversations with government. Government know that what we're asking for is, from UK Sports point of view, an early and exceptional rollover. So as I said, our funding commitment runs out in March 2021. What we really need, and ideally need sort of confirmation in the next few weeks, is that we could get a 1-year rollover to go on to March 2022 to make sure we can reassure all the sports that their funding and is going to be in place and they can have some consistency going forward through to the games next year.
Sorry, just to clarify that, what you're asking for effectively is the same amount of money from March 2021 guaranteed as you've had in the previous 12 months. Is that right?
Exactly right. We have we want the 1-year rollover, and also we have a government underwrite that sits below the national lottery, because part of our income comes from the national lottery good causes as well. And obviously we don't know the impact of the coronavirus on those lottery sales. So we will need the underwrite as well as the 1-year exceptional rollover to make sure we can give certainty to the sector.
What will happen if this doesn't happen?
It's a very good question. To be honest, we're not sure. Sports have already taken as many decisions as they can to minimise the loss. They're already struggling from loss of revenues, from sponsorship, from membership, from events being cancelled. So they have made cuts. They've also, where possible, used some of the furlough schemes. So they're already, as every sport we've heard this morning, is suffering individual pain. If we can give them the reassurance that the long-term funding is in place, then they will not need to make decisions that could be really quite disastrous for the sport. It's the unknown that's the risk, because as you'll know, in high performance sport, it's a very long-term planning game, and we want to give some long-term certainty.
But I can remember back, I'm old enough quite clearly, to remember back to Atlanta 96. I remember I think we won 1 gold that time. And if I remember rightly, the yachting team, I think it was, had to sell their kit in order to get home. That was the sort of state of elite level athletics and sports in this country. Is there a danger here that this event could retard our abilities to compete in the way in which we have done, which as a nation we've absolutely loved over the last 4 or 5 Olympics?
Atlanta is a great example. I think what we've seen in this sort of 20 years since the Atlanta 1996 Games is the impact, the brilliant impact, the National Lottery and the investment from successive governments. We've had brilliant support, because I think people recognise now that when the Games time comes around, it has this incredible positive impact on the whole of society, not just for the athletes that compete, and I've had the great privilege of being one of those, but the society around you really feel the buy-in from the public support. And what we've seen is when Team GB, when Paralympics GB do well, then over 75% of the population say they are proud of the success of that team. So we've had incredible investment for over 20 years, and there is a very real threat that amazing investment so far would be at risk if we suddenly our teams are not as successful next year because we can't get confirmation of funding.
Before I move on, just one final cue. But however, on the flip side of that, there could be those who are saying that actually, there are charities that are facing a potential £4 billion shortfall. We've heard about football with the lower leagues with 200 million, cricket with 380 million. There's a lot of people that are asking for a lot of money from many, many different sports. Is it not a luxury we can no longer afford to support the Olympics in the way in which we have in the recent past?
I think what we're very conscious of is that it's not just the sports sector. Every single sector in society right now is in need of money, is in need of reassurance, is in need of different demands. And the government have many, many demands across the Treasury. What we're saying is that very strongly believe that the Olympics and Paralympics does hold a special place in the public's hearts and minds. And, you know, I think we saw that very recently when the Paralympics was put into the protected category of free-to-air viewing. It's why the Olympics is free-to-air viewing protected. It is seen as a very important thing for society. So yes, we're not saying that the other things aren't equally deserving, but I really strongly feel the Olympics and Paralympics is as deserving as any.
Thank you. Kevin Brennan.
Thank you, Dame Katherine, for appearing before us, and we really thank you for describing us as a group of new faces. That's very, very much appreciated. On this point about funding, if we were to do any kind of recommendations off the back of this session to the government, I think it probably goes without saying, but do you think that we should highlight the importance of that funding being extended for our for next year?
Yes, I mean, as I've said, we've been in very close talks with the government. DCMS have been incredibly supportive of our needs going forward, and every step over the last sort of 6-7 weeks when we've been discussing with sports, government has wanted to know how those discussions are going, what the scale of the problem is, what is looking realistic of needing to support the teams next summer. I think what would be good is, as much as possible, is to get that answer as soon as possible. So
yeah, and ideally by when?
Well, I think in the next few weeks would be ideal.
Okay, all right. You medalled in 5 successive Olympic Games. If you'd had to go through this sort of situation as an elite athlete, yeah, give us an insight into how that would have affected you sort of mentally and physically in terms of your preparation, and how it might be affecting our current athletes.
Yeah, it's a brilliant point. It's also something, even for me, even after 20 years experience in high performance sport, it's still slightly speculative, because I went to 5 Olympic Games, like you said, but no athlete in history of the Olympic Games has ever had a postponed Olympic Games. This is unique. We've had Olympics cancelled because of world wars, but never had them postponed. So what's important to understand is, in this, you know, it was only, you know, the end of March that the decision was made. In March of the Olympic year, you're only 4 or 5 months away from the actual event, and it feels very close. It feels very real. You're in those last few steps. You've done all the hard work. You've got through the last winter that you will need to get through, and it sort of feels like, you know, that it's sitting right in front of you. And it also, there's a certainty to the Olympic and the Paralympic Games. That date is set in stone as far as you're concerned for years. So you can mentally and sort of physically plan for the peak at a certain date, and you know it won't shift. So the fact that it's changed, I think initially for all athletes it would have been a relief, because the doubt and the uncertainty was building and building, and the risks of competing or trying to compete or trying to train with serious health risks was getting too much for a lot of people. So I think the decision to delay was really important. The relief was instant. But then there's the coming to terms. It's almost a grief cycle, the coming to terms of what this actually means now. For some athletes, it's this might have been their last event. They were planning life beyond. They've got a year of, again, seems a big chunk of time. You know, can I go another year? For some people, they might have been injured this year. They might have not been at the peak, and actually it's bought them a bit of time. So there's different athletes in different situations. If I was going through it again, I think it would, it was probably different. If it was my build up to 2012, I'd be incredibly disappointed, because you know, we were ready to go, ready to perform on that big stage. If it was lead up to 2016, I could have maybe done with a bit more time, if I'm honest. So it might not have been the end of the world. But I think it's such a, you know, those events are so emotional. They're so passionate. You know, you are aware of the public support. You're aware of this amazing opportunity to put your sport on display and unite a nation in a way that very little does. And what a privilege that is. And to sort of have that on pause is hard. But the one thing I will say, and the last thing I'll say on this, is sports and athletes are incredibly agile, incredibly resilient. They are incredibly good at rechanging focus and aiming for the next thing. The good thing is they know it's next year now. And they also, the athletes I've spoken to, they've got incredible perspective. They understand what's happening around them. They understand the scale of this pandemic and the tragedy it's causing. So they don't, you know, think, oh, poor sport. They're thinking, you know, we're lucky what we have right now, and we're lucky we still have an event to look forward to.
It does give you a year to think about coming out of retirement and making a comeback, possibly.
Wow. I'll let you know how that goes.
Can I just ask you finally, you know, what your I was fortunate enough to go to the Rugby World Cup in Japan last autumn, and it's an incredible country and a marvelous place to hold, you know, a major sporting event, you know, with an incredible people and very welcoming atmosphere. But what do you think? What's your assessment of our medal prospects? And we were talking about the debacle that was Atlanta, but for next year in Japan. And do you have any tips for any Katherine Graingers of the future that might be there that we haven't yet heard of, that you know of through your work with UK sport?
I think, I mean, medal-wise, you can always look sort of in the build-up to a games, but it's quite simple to compare it to 4 years before and where we were before Rio, where we were before London, and you can see how the team going. And the team was in a, you know, not dissimilar positions to before Rio and London. So I think we're all quite optimistic about what could be delivered in Tokyo. There was still uncertainty about numbers of qualified athletes. We still don't know what the ultimate team will look like. So it was still, you know, reasonably early days. We don't really put out sort of target predictions until much closer to the games time. But I think it was looking very positive. And as you said, I think there was a huge excitement about what and how Tokyo could deliver. It would be, you know, really will be an extraordinary games. And I think now, looking forward to next year, I think, as I've said, these events are very emotional. I think the fact that if it all goes ahead next year as we hope, it could potentially be the first global gathering of the world. And, you know, the Olympics and Paralympics have always been at its heart a sporting event, but it's an incredible gathering event of human endeavor and human spirit and possibility, and it's why so many people find it inspiring. And I think if next year goes ahead as planned, it will be on a whole new scale.
And any hot tips for us?
Well, there'll be many names you know already that we're looking forward to, and the most exciting thing for me is their names that right now nobody will know who will break through next year.
Well, I'm asking.
No, I'm not going to give you the tips yet. It's too much pressure on those athletes as well. But I can guarantee you will be thrilled by some of the performances next year by people you've never heard of right now.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Clive Efford.
Yeah, following on from that, the issue about predicted medal haul. I mean, Sport England has been pretty accurate in its predictions in the past, but some of our sort of big ticket sports have not been performing as well. Cycling, for instance, had a disastrous World Championships. So have you been, I mean, you said you were expecting a similar haul, but going forwards, how has COVID and the postponement affected your projections in terms of the medal haul? Have you been able to make any calculations how the delay will affect that?
Yeah, I can honestly say at the moment we're not making any predictions right now. As I've said, even in a normal year, we wouldn't have numbers sort of in play until much closer to the games. So how we set the targets is every sport we work with very closely and discuss what their targets are, and then we put them together cumulatively so that every sport sort of adds up to that's the big number we can predict or expect. And sports won't know until much closer to the time. A lot of events still, I mean, even if it had been the Olympics going ahead this summer, still wouldn't have the qualified numbers finalised. So we still won't know till much closer to next year. And to your point on how COVID might affect this, I mean, we are a long way, I think, from knowing realistically where the athletes will be when we come out of this.
So will qualifying dates be affected? I assume they will, and that they'll be postponed by a year too. So where perhaps qualifying wasn't as successful as it might have been, then there's another opportunity for that, is there, for both the Olympics and the Paralympics?
Yeah, and you're spot on with some of the sports that were used to being very successful, maybe not where they want to be right now this year, but actually a year from now could be in a lot stronger position. So some sports, even within our own country, will change their predictions between next year and where we would have been this year potentially. But I think the qualification route is still going to be quite complex, because what the International Olympic Committee and the Paralympic Committee equivalent have both said is that they only want to run the qualification events when they know there'll be a very fair playing field internationally. So right now, obviously, every country is in a different position with the coronavirus, and they will not run events until they know that they can do it fairly and it is a it is fair for every nation to try and compete for those numbers. So I think next year, I think they'll still take their time to decide what qualification will look like next year and if the events will change at all. Some have qualified already this year and those places will hold to next year, but most sports are waiting to hear what next year will look like.
Well, let's hope that some of those sports get back to those marginal gains that Dave Brailsford was so successful at, because I think cycling could do with taking a leaf out of his book. Just one other issue is about participation, because the Olympics and Paralympics are very successful in boosting interest in sport and participation. I mean, have you made any assessment about the implications of the postponement for that, and how to maintain interest whilst we wait for that big injection of interest that comes around the Olympics?
I know, you're absolutely right. We are very lucky as an event in that, every 4 years you sort of get, the nation turns the Olympics and Paralympics, and there is a very direct effect of how many people want to go and try new events. And having seen that on the big stage, having seen great athletes in those inspirational moments about what they can try themselves, and it's why it's so important we have our teams ready and supported well for next year, because they know that's the biggest show on earth to really inspire new young people, new generations back into sport. What will affect this year will be, and as every sport you've talked to this morning, is we don't know what sport will be able to be on show this summer at all. There are definitely always still ongoing projects to make sure that whether it's our own athletes we can access, or wider field, how to still showcase those great role models of what is possible within sport. Their stories are really important. We have this thing called athlete volunteer appearances. So every athlete that's in receipt of National Lottery funding and gets to sort of give back some time to their local communities. And even though they're not able to compete on the big stage this summer, there'll still be opportunities for them to link to communities, to just tell their stories of what sport has done for them, what it's meant for them, and what's possible through sport. So there's still many channels we'll use to make sure that those stories are told, even if realistically we'll wait till next year for the real big platform.
Yeah, I mean, do you have a figure at all for the economic impact that a big sporting event like the Olympics and Paralympics has, for the economy, and getting people out there buying kit and getting involved in sport? Do you have any assessment of that at all?
I don't to hand right now. I certainly can find out and add it to our written submission after this to look at the big numbers, but I know there'll be huge numbers.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you, Clive. And that's our final question. I'm going to conclude the session now. Just to thank you, Dame Katherine Grainger, and also Tim Hollingsworth, who both appeared on this panel. Thank you. Order, order.
Digital Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee, virtual meeting, 5th of May 2020.